Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I'm 56 years old. Life hasn't exactly turned out the way I thought it would. My husband, Jonathan, passed away 2 years ago. He was a kind man, but distant, always lost in his work or thoughts. When he was gone, I thought I'd spend the rest of my days quietly, gardening, attending family events, and reading in the evenings. That summer, Nathan came to visit. Nathan is Jonathan's nephew, 28 years old, and full of a restless energy that I couldn't quite place. He had just finished a long stint in the city and wanted to spend some time in the countryside, away from the noise. At first, he kept to himself, walking through the woods or reading on the porch. But slowly, we started talking about everything and nothing. He had a way of asking questions that made me feel seen, really seen, for the first time in years. One afternoon, I was struggling with a creaky old fence in the garden when Nathan offered to help. He worked silently, but with purpose, and I couldn't help but notice how different he was from Jonathan. Where Jonathan was always preoccupied, Nathan seemed present, grounded. As the days passed, I found myself looking forward to our talks. There was something about his company that brought a lightness to the air, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the trees, I decided to tackle the attic. It was one of those projects I'd been putting off for years. Too many memories, too much dust. I tied my hair back, grabbed some old boxes, and started sorting through them. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his shirt sticking to his skin from the summer heat. "Need a hand?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Before I could answer, he stepped inside and picked up a heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Careful," I said. "That's probably older than both of us combined." He chuckled, setting it down gently. "Then it's a good thing I'm here to help." As we worked, we came across a box of old photographs. I couldn't help but smile as I showed him pictures from my younger days. He studied each one carefully, his green eyes thoughtful. "You were beautiful," he said softly, holding up a picture of me in my 20s. I laughed, brushing it off. "That was a long time ago." "Doesn't matter," he said, his gaze lingering on the photo before meeting mine. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken, but unmistakable. The air in the room felt heavier, like the space between us had shifted. I looked away, focusing on the box in front of me. These old things, they're just reminders of a life that feels so far away now. Nathan moved closer, his voice low. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel so far away." I froze, unsure of what to say. His words hung in the air, filled with a weight I didn't know how to carry. "Eleanor," he said gently, his hand brushing my lips and reaching out from them. "You don't have to do this alone. Life doesn't end just because someone you loved is gone." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. There was so much I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, letting his words sink in. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Nathan had gone out for a walk, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My mind kept drifting back to the attic, to the way Nathan's words had stirred something in me. When he returned, his cheeks were flushed from the evening air. He sat down across from me, his gaze thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "About what you said earlier, about not doing this alone." Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said softly. I see how much you've been carrying, and I know what that feels like." His words caught me off guard. "You do?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Losing people, it changes you, makes you feel like you have to hold everything together on your own. But you don't, Eleanor. You don't have to. Something in his voice, earnest, almost pleading, made me believe him. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, even if just a little. We sat there for a long time, the quiet between us comfortable, almost soothing. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. "Good night, Nathan," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the house. The next day, I found myself looking for excuses to spend time with him. Whether it was fixing things around the house or working in the garden, I felt drawn to his presence in a way I couldn't explain. One afternoon, as we planted flowers along the fence, I asked him about his life in the city. He spoke of long hours at work, of feeling out of place, of wanting something more. "Is that why you came here?" I asked. He nodded, his hands brushing the soil. I guess I was hoping to find some clarity, or at least a little peace. I smiled, understanding all too well. "You've come to the right place for that." He looked up at me then, his green eyes searching mine. "Have I?" he asked, his voice low. The question hung in the air between us, full of meaning I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I turned back to the flowers, my hands trembling slightly. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album I had left out earlier. His fingers moved gently over the pages, pausing now and then to study a picture. "Is this your wedding day?" he asked, holding up a photo of Alfred and me standing in front of the church. I nodded, setting the pot on the stove. "It was, a lifetime ago." "You look happy," he said, though there was a hint of something else in his tone. Curiosity, perhaps, or sadness. "We were," I replied, keeping my focus on the vegetables I was chopping. "In our own way." He closed the album and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "And now?" I stopped chopping and turned to face him. "And now? I'm figuring out what comes next." Nathan's eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. As the days went by, our conversations grew deeper. He told me about his childhood, his dreams, and the things that had left him feeling lost. I shared stories of my own, ones I hadn't spoken aloud in years. One night, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the darkness, Nathan turned to me. "Do you ever think about starting over?" he asked. "Starting over?" I repeated, unsure of what he meant. "Yeah," he said. "Leaving the past behind, finding something new, someone new." His words caught me off guard, but I didn't look away. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I've always thought it was too late for that." "It's never too late," he said softly, his gaze steady. The turn of the moon came on a rainy afternoon. The storm had rolled in quickly, and we found ourselves trapped inside. I was in the living room, sorting through old books, when Nathan joined me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice warm. I smiled. "Sure, these can go in the donut pile." As he knelt beside me, our hands brushed against each other. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark through me, a reminder of how alive I still was. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His green eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name, something that made my heart race. Before I could say anything, he reached out and took my hand in his. "You're not alone," he said, his voice steady. "Not anymore." And just like that, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. The days that followed were a mix of clarity and confusion. Nathan and I had crossed an invisible line, one I wasn't sure either of us fully understood. Yet, there was no denying the comfort and the spark that his presence brought into my life. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to fall in golden waves, Nathan and I decided to take a walk through the woods. The silence between us was warm, not heavy, as if words weren't necessary. At one point, we stopped by a small clearing. He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor, I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant. I raised an eyebrow, urging him to continue. "I don't know where this path leads," he said, motioning between the two of us. "But I know I don't want to walk it without you." My breath caught in my chest. The vulnerability in his words touched something deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Nathan," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't have the answers. I don't even know if I'm ready to find them." He smiled softly. "Then let's figure it out together. Let's." The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my past alone, convinced that it was my burden to bear. But here was Nathan, offering to share it with me, without judgment or expectation. As we stood there in the clearing, the wind rustling through the trees, I realized something. Life doesn't always give us neat resolutions or perfect endings. Sometimes, it simply gives us a chance to start anew. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. "Together," I echoed, a small smile forming on my lips. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, we sat on the porch, a blanket draped over our shoulders. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that came from knowing that, while the road ahead might be uncertain, I wasn't walking it alone. Nathan glanced at me, his green eyes full of warmth. "You know," he said, "I think this is the beginning of something good." I nodded, my heart light. "I think so too." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the world and the promise of tomorrow, I let myself believe it. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. And as for the future, well, that was ours to write.